Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? At my own wedding, the day that was supposed to be the most important moment of my life, I watched my father get escorted to the very back row of the ceremony, not by accident, not because there were no seats left, but because someone made a choice to treat him like an afterthought, a man whose only role was to sign checks and disappear, while my stepfather stood tall and proud, taking my arm, walking me down the aisle as if the title of Dad could be bought with money or secured with a loud voice at family dinners. I stayed silent because I knew if I opened my mouth in that moment, nothing would come out but rage, and the truth is, I had already decided to play the long game. You see, for months leading up to this day, I had been swallowing the same kind of poison in small doses. Every conversation about flowers or menus or invitations was twisted into some kind of performance about how generous my mother and her husband Gary were, how they were taking care of everything, how my father should just be grateful to be included at all. Never mind that my father, Michael, had been paying my tuition, covering medical bills, and helping with rent for years, quietly, without ever demanding credit. Never mind that when my internships barely paid anything, he slipped grocery cards into my coat pocket so I would not have to choose between food and the train to work. None of that counted, because it was not shiny and it did not come with a speech. The wedding planner, a woman named Brooke, became the unofficial messenger of my mother's version of events. She would call me to clarify things, but by clarify, she meant confirm that the changes my mother wanted, extra guests, a bigger cake, upgraded linens, were already locked in, with the understanding that the parents were covering it. And when she said parents, she never meant both. She meant my mother and Gary. My father was never mentioned in those conversations, except when Brooke would casually ask if he had sent his check yet, as if he were some bank transfer to be verified. I noticed every word. I kept every receipt. I said nothing. The moment I saw him sitting in the back row alone, I felt a kind of heat that settled in my chest and would not leave. My dad did not complain. He smiled, waved when he saw me, and sat with his hands folded, like he was used to it, like this was not the first time he had been asked to play invisible for the sake of my mother's story. And that broke me in ways I cannot explain. I walked down the aisle with Gary's arm locked in mine, and the flashbulbs popped, and the guests cheered, and I knew the pictures would tell one story, but I also knew something else. I knew every contract in that room had my name on it, not my mother's, not Gary's, not even my father's. Mine. When the ceremony was over and the cocktails began, I slipped away with my best friend Tasha, the only person I trusted completely. We ducked into the coat room with my phone and a folder of vendor documents I had saved to the cloud. While everyone else clinked glasses and complimented the decor, I opened the payment authorizations and stared at the clauses most people never read. The venue had a strict capacity limit, with heavy overage charges for unapproved guest counts, and I knew for a fact that my mother had insisted on adding at least 24 people without asking me. I had proof of the email chain where she pressured the planner into squeezing them in. The overage charges would not hit me, not if I adjusted the authorizations to reflect the real signer on those changes. Tasha leaned over my shoulder as I typed. She said, "Are you really doing this?" I said, "They wanted to treat my dad like a wallet. Let's see how they like it when the bill lands in the right wallet." With a few clicks, I switched the responsibility for all overages and upgrades to my mother and Gary, since their names were on the add-ons. The base package, the one I had paid for with a joint account my dad helped fund, remained untouched. The penalties for exceeding fire code, the extra charges for last-minute decor swaps, and the late fees for the linens my mother insisted on, all of it now pointed exactly where it belonged. When I walked back into the ballroom, no one noticed that anything had changed. My mother was basking in compliments about the flowers, Gary was bragging about the cake size, and my father was quietly standing near the bar, talking to Ethan, my husband, who looked uncomfortable but polite. The band started up, the photographer moved through the crowd, and the laughter rang out like everything was perfect. But I kept watching the venue manager. He was carrying a clipboard, glancing at the tables, counting chairs, nodding to his assistant. Then he spotted my mother. He walked straight to her, bent down, and pointed at the paper. I raised my glass, smiled, and pretended to listen to someone compliment my dress. Inside, I was steady for the first time that entire day. The thing about being treated like a checkbook is that people forget checkbooks also keep records, and records can speak louder than any aisle walk. The venue manager handed my mother the clipboard. Her smile faltered for the first time all night, and I knew round one had just begun. The thing about weddings is that the cracks people spend years trying to plaster over begin to show the moment the money is questioned, and after the venue manager delivered the clipboard with the extra charges highlighted in bold, I could practically hear those cracks splitting in real time, because my stepfather's booming laugh turned into a stutter as he demanded to know why he was being asked to cover several $1,000s in overage fees. My mother flushed red and tried to insist there must be a mistake, and I stood off to the side pretending to be fascinated by the hors d'oeuvres while memorizing every twitch of panic on their faces. I did not say a word, not yet, because I knew that if money was enough to make them sweat, then what I had planned next would leave them choking on their own arrogance, and this time the entire room would see it. You have to understand that the aisle moment was only half of the insult, because the reception program, carefully typed out and handed to the DJ, featured a slot labeled father-daughter dance. And even though it was supposed to be the moment when my dad and I reclaimed at least a sliver of dignity, my mother had instructed the planner to substitute Gary's name in bold letters while my dad's was quietly erased, as if he had never existed outside of invoices. I discovered this little alteration the week before when Brooke accidentally forwarded me the wrong version of the program, and rather than confronting anyone then, I let it sit, because I wanted the reveal to happen when it could not be walked back. When no one could quietly shuffle papers and claim it had been a simple oversight. As the crowd finished their meals and the DJ signaled he was about to announce the dance, I walked over and handed him a folded slip of paper with a short line I had drafted weeks earlier, knowing this moment was coming. He glanced at it, gave me a raised eyebrow, and I nodded once. Instead of introducing the bride and her father, or, worse, the bride and her stepfather, he took the microphone and said clearly, "It is time for the dance we have renamed tonight, the Parents Who Showed Up Dance." The room went silent for a heartbeat, people looking at one another, unsure if they had heard correctly, and then I turned, walked across the floor, and extended my hand to my dad. He looked stunned, as if part of him could not believe I would do it, but then he rose slowly, and when he took my hand, I felt something stronger than any vow I had spoken earlier in the ceremony. The music began, and we moved across the floor while whispers ran through the guests, some clapping, some dabbing their eyes, others exchanging looks that said, "Finally, the truth is being spoken out loud without a single word of argument." My stepfather made a motion to join us, but I shook my head firmly, without drama, and my husband Ethan, who had been so careful all day not to pick sides, finally stepped forward, blocking Gary with a quiet firmness that told me I was not alone. For 3 minutes the music carried us, and the photos captured not just a dance, but the reality no one could erase, a man who had been present for every practice, every doctor's appointment, every late-night call when I thought I could not keep going, finally being acknowledged in front of everyone who had once been told to forget him. The applause when the song ended was not the polite clapping you hear at receptions. It was heavy, heartfelt, the kind that comes from people realizing they had been watching a performance for years and had finally seen something real. My mother tried to save face by laughing too loudly, clapping harder than anyone else, insisting she had known all along that this was what I wanted. But her smile was tight and her eyes flickered with the kind of fury that only comes when control is slipping through your fingers. Gary, meanwhile, stood stiffly at his table, jaw clenched, pretending not to care, though the way he avoided eye contact told me everything I needed to know. The planner whispered frantically to my mother, and I saw the color drain from her face as she looked toward the projector screen, realizing what was about to play was not the curated slideshow she had insisted upon, but something else entirely. Something I had quietly switched behind her back with the help of Tasha. I could see the panic begin to ripple through her movements, the way she half rose from her chair and whispered to Brooke to stop the show, but it was too late. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered. And the first image that appeared was not a glossy studio portrait of Gary holding me in some staged embrace, but a grainy photograph of me at 7 years old with a science fair ribbon, my dad kneeling beside me, holding the display board steady with one hand and ruffling my hair with the other. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for the next image, and I stood very still, feeling the weight of the moment gather, because everyone was about to learn, frame by frame, that while some people threw money at appearances, others quietly built a life that no one could deny once it was laid out in front of them without a single caption. And as the first slide faded into the next, I thought to myself that this was only the beginning, because photographs can do what speeches never can. They cut through the noise, they freeze time, and they tell the truth without ever raising their voice. The first image held the room in a way no toast ever could. And as the projector hummed and the lights softened, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because I knew that once people were watching my childhood unfold without commentary or spin, there would be no going back to the version of events my mother had spent years rehearsing. And while the second and third photos slid into place, birthday candles in a cramped kitchen my dad had painted himself, a lopsided costume he had stitched together. At midnight, because the school notice came late, a folding chair at every boring recital where the applause sounded like relief more than celebration. I could hear the whisper of chair legs and the small astonished sounds people make when something true walks into the room and asks to be seen, and inside that hush the venue manager approached my mother and stepfather with his clipboard, cleared his throat, and very politely explained that the head count had exceeded the fire code by more than a handful, that the late additions and the extra rental equipment had not been approved by the primary signer, and that according to the contract the penalties and fees would be charged to the party who authorized the changes, which, as the attached email chain confirmed, was not me. My stepfather tried bluster first, because bluster has always been his favorite tool, and he raised his voice just enough to make nearby tables turn their heads while he informed the manager that he had been told everything was covered, that the planner knew the plan, that surely there had been a misunderstanding, and the manager, who had the patience of someone who has dealt with many families and many versions of the truth, replied that there was no misunderstanding at all since the amendments had been signed by my mother with my stepfather copied. The capacity clause was clear, the penalties were automatic, and the balance would need to be settled before the end of the night if they wanted the staff to continue service without interruption. Which was the moment my mother's face did a flicker I had only seen once before, during a school conference, when a teacher politely mentioned that I was doing fine without anyone's intervention, and I understood that for her the worst part was not the cost, but the loss of control. While the slideshow moved into middle school awkwardness and part-time job pay stubs and the hand-me-down car my dad coaxed into starting every winter, Brooke the planner tried to insert herself as the savior who could fix it if only someone would let her. And she started saying the word "we" in a way that meant you, as she gently implied that if I had just approved the extra guests we would not be having this little hiccup, at which point I turned to her with a patience I did not feel and told her that the documentation showed exactly who had pushed the head count beyond the limit, that she had accepted instructions from a contact who was not the client of record, that she had ignored 3 emails where I asked for final numbers in writing, and that the only reason we were not halting service immediately was because I had chosen to leave the base package intact on my own payment method, which made her swallow hard and look down at her tablet as if it might provide a different past if she scrolled far enough. I could sense the old instinct rising in me to smooth everything over and keep the peace, the reflex trained into daughters who have spent years being told that their calm is the oil that keeps the family machine from grinding. And I almost laughed at how familiar it felt to be standing between other people's mess and the impulse to clean it up, except this time I did not step in because the contract was already doing the work. And the truth is that silence can be power when it is paired with preparation. So instead of raising my voice, I walked to the DJ, thanked him for handling the earlier announcement with care, and let him know we would be skipping the gimmicky traditions that turn receptions into circus acts. No garter toss and no bouquet competition, and we would replace them with a short note asking guests who planned to leave cash in envelopes to consider a small donation in my dad's name to the community scholarship fund we had supported for years, and the DJ, who looked like a man who had seen every flavor of family drama a ballroom can serve, nodded once and said he would handle it exactly as written. By the time the slideshow reached the years when I moved out and called my dad on nights when rent felt like a cliff, the manager had finished his conversation, my stepfather had resorted to threatening to take this to the owner, and my mother had begun the delicate dance of blaming the planner without saying the words out loud. Yet none of that could compete with the simple gravity of images of a man holding a handmade sign at a college move-in day or eating cold pizza at a folding table in an apartment with no curtains because we were waiting on the deposit refund, and I felt the room turn toward us with something like respect. Not the syrupy kind that melts as soon as the cake is cut, but the respectful quiet that recognizes steady hands and unglamorous effort. Ethan drifted to my side and placed his fingers lightly against my back in a way that said I am here without turning me into a project to be managed. And in that small gesture I found the permission I apparently still craved to keep executing what I had mapped out in a dozen anxious evenings before this day. So when my stepfather finally spun toward me and hissed that I had humiliated the family and would regret it when the invoices hit his account, I met his eyes and told him that contracts are not instruments of humiliation but of clarity, that I was done protecting the image he liked to project, and that if he wanted to keep a ledger, he should have considered that ledgers do not only record money paid, but patterns of behavior. After which I turned away because there is nothing to be gained by arguing with a man whose favorite audience is himself. As the last photo lingered, a grainy picture of my father dozing in a hospital chair after sitting with me through a long night when a specialist ran tests we could not afford without his help. The room exhaled in that collective way that tells you everyone has made up their mind, and there will not be a return to the old script. Yet just as the lights rose and the staff prepared to serve dessert, the venue manager approached again with a look that said more news was coming, and while my mother reached for her clutch as if a different credit card might change the past, he asked to speak with the add-on signer about a second fire code penalty tied to the dance floor crowding because the extra guests had pushed us over a threshold during the first set, which meant the total due had grown by another chunk that would close the night one way or another, and I understood in that stretched second that the next move was mine, and that the difference between noise and consequence was about to get very clear. By the time dessert plates were cleared and the last round of toasts had sputtered into awkward gratitude that tried and failed to paper over the tension that had been building in plain sight, I had already decided that the rest of this night and the hours that followed would no longer belong to the curated version of our family my mother had been polishing for years, because if the money had drawn blood and the dance had torn the veil, then the story itself, what survives in pictures, in captions, in thank you notes, in the quiet digital trails people assume no one will check, needed to be wrestled out of the hands of the people who had confused volume with truth. So while the band packed away their brass and the cousins searched for rides and the older guests slipped into the lobby to complain about parking, I pulled the photographer aside, opened the contract on my phone to the paragraph I had highlighted weeks ago, and pointed to the line that stated clearly that I, as the client of record, retained final approval over album selection, social media posting, and any public use of the images, which meant that the shots that pretended a different man had raised me would not see daylight unless I allowed it, and I did not. The photographer, who had the soft eyes of someone who hates conflict but loves getting things right, asked in a careful voice whether I wanted a balanced album that honored all parts of the family. And I told her that balance does not mean giving equal weight to truth and performance. It means telling what happened and who showed up when there was nothing to photograph. So we stood together at a makeshift workstation near the service hall and flagged images in real time, my father adjusting my veil with the practical gentleness of a man who has fixed every wobbly hinge in my life, my mother and stepfather posing like magazine subscribers who believe a lens is a mirror for status. Ethan watching me with that steady focus he wears when he chooses not to perform, The tables that seated the added guests packed beyond the agreed count like proof of a lie that thought it could hide in noise, and while we worked, I asked the photographer to remove from public consideration every frame that staged my stepfather as the star of an aisle he did not earn, not because I needed to erase him, but because I would not be a party to the erasure of someone else again. Once the selects were secured and the embargo on public posting was set to require my written approval, I moved on to the next lever, which was deceptively small but devastatingly effective. Because wedding stories are carried forward as much by gratitude as by pictures, and in the middle of the night when vendors are loading trucks and relatives are negotiating leftover centerpieces, no one is thinking about envelopes and lists. Yet that is exactly when narratives harden into the aftertaste. People keep. So I opened the spreadsheet Tasha and I had prepped with ruthless clarity and began drafting the thank you notes that would go out within the first 24 hours, each one warm and specific and stubbornly truthful, naming, without flourish or apology, the ways my father had supported me over the years, the rent when unpaid internships ate my savings, the car that barely made it through winters but got me to interviews, the insurance premiums that kept me in a specialist's office when the cheaper clinic could not help, and I made sure those acknowledgments were not private murmurs, but the printed heart of the message, because nothing undermines a fake story faster than precise gratitude directed at the right person. In that same quiet hour, I wrote one more message that did not go to a guest list at all, but traveled only to the person who had insisted at the rehearsal dinner that my father should sit in the back, because he is just a checkbook. A text I kept brief not because brevity is kind but because when the evidence is already stacked and labeled there is no need to grandstand. So I forwarded his exact words back to him with a line that said, "You put this in writing and I stopped pretending you did." Not, and then I put my phone face down and let the silence do its work, because men like Gary believe volume is consequence and are never prepared for a mirror that offers them their own sentence with no decoration. By dawn the messages began arriving in a steady, frantic stream, some from my mother in the language of control: fix this, call me, I will forgive you if you undo the album notes and return the dance to what it was supposed to be. You have embarrassed us in front of people who matter, some from extended relatives who wanted to both cheer me and keep their own Thanksgiving invitations secure, some from guests who had watched the slideshow with wet eyes and confessed that it made them pick up the phone to call a parent they had quietly sidelined, and threaded between all of that like a string you do not see until it tightens were the 17 messages from my daughter self to the adult I finally let out. Because each ping from my father's number was patient and careful and full of relief he did not try to hide, saying he loved me, saying I did not owe him a performance, saying the kitchen light was on if Ethan and I wanted to bring leftover cake and sit without making it a negotiation. And every one of those texts landed like proof that I had not been cruel, I had been exact. As the sun burned through the paper shade and the city began its ordinary noise, I sent 2 final notes that set the reputational concrete for good to the photographer. A concise approval for a preview gallery that centered the people and moments that told the truth without petty omissions, along with a caption template that named my father in the plain language of thanks, and to the guests, a set of thank yous that linked to the community scholarship fund my dad and I had backed for years, with a line that explained we were redirecting part of the wedding gifts there in lieu of more things no one needed, which turned out to be the cleanest way to make the story public without a single speech. Because people will talk about generosity all week and they will repeat the name on the dedication plaque without even knowing they are carrying your correction into rooms you will never enter. Only then did I allow myself the smallest private act of closure, which was to open the album draft my mother had tried to rush into circulation and click decline on the entire set. Not to punish her, but to end the habit of letting other people publish a life that never belonged to them, and as I watched the status flip from pending to blocked I felt something inside me settle, not a triumphal drumbeat or a vindictive cheer, just the measured relief of a person who finally stopped begging a room full of actors to play a role they were never going to accept, and who, instead, learned how to run the lights, call the cues, and close the curtain on a scene that had been hurting everyone who loved the truth more than applause. By the time the last guest had left and the tables stood stripped of flowers and linens, I realized that the final piece of this long Messy Puzzle was not about invoices or photographs or even the bruised egos of people who had wanted to script a story that never belonged to them, but about something quieter and heavier, the question of who I was going to be moving forward and which name, which history, and which loyalty I was going to carry with me, because as much as revenge feels satisfying, in the moment, what lingers long after the lights are out is whether you are finally standing in a life that feels honest or whether you are still trapped in someone else's version of it. I had spent months preparing documents and filing papers in silence, not because I wanted to hide from anyone, but because I wanted the decision to be mine alone, free from the pressure of speeches or the manipulations of guilt. So when I opened the sealed envelope I had tucked into my bag weeks earlier and looked at the certified copy of my legal filings, I felt the kind of grounded certainty that no wedding toast or slideshow could shake, because on that paper was the choice to keep my last name, the one that tied me to my father in a way no seating chart could erase, and to attach it formally and permanently to the identity I had built for myself, which meant that no matter how many staged photos my mother ordered or how many loud claims my stepfather made about being the man who stepped up, the law and the truth would now agree that I belonged to myself and to the man who had shown up when it mattered. I knew my mother would read that as an attack and that Gary would treat it like a defeat in some unspoken contest he had invented, but for me it was not about tearing anything down. It was about refusing to live another day pretending that the most constant presence in my life had been some shadowy checkbook to be thanked once a year, and so as the sun came up and I sat with Ethan at the small kitchen table in our apartment, I explained what I had done, how I had set up the filings weeks before, how I had arranged for a portion of the monetary gifts we had received to be redirected into a scholarship in my father's name, designed for students who grew up with steady but unsung parents who did not get the spotlight but carried the weight anyway, and how the receipt for that donation would arrive in my mother's mailbox whether she wanted it or not, because the IRS does not care about pride, it cares about records, and sometimes records are the cleanest way to end an argument you never should have been pulled into. Ethan listened carefully, not interrupting, and when I finished, he nodded and said only that he had married me because I knew who I was even when other people tried to tell me otherwise, and that was the kind of affirmation that does not glitter but lasts. Later that morning I gathered the 17 unsent drafts I had typed into my phone during the reception, fragments of words I had wanted to speak, but swallowed because the timing was never right. And instead of deleting them I bundled them into one message and sent them all at once to my father, each line simple and clear. I saw you. I am sorry for letting them silence you. I fixed it. I will not let it happen again. You are the one who raised me. And I am done acting like your role is a footnote. He replied with just 3 words, come over now, and so Ethan and I packed up leftover cake in a paper box, drove across town to the small house where I had grown up, and sat down in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust, the place where my father had patched more drywall and mended more broken things than I could count. We cut cake with butter knives. We laughed at the absurdity of spending thousands of dollars on a night that would be remembered for the moments money could not buy, and we made a plan for holidays that did not revolve around pleasing people who only cared about the performance of family rather than the work of it. There was no dramatic confrontation that day, no shouting match or slam doors, because sometimes the most devastating revenge is not fireworks, but absence, the quiet refusal to keep playing a role in a script you never wrote. And as I sat with my father and my husband, planning small things like who would host Thanksgiving and how to manage birthdays without chaos, I realized that the victory had already been won, not in the penalties charged or the photos withheld, but in the fact that I no longer needed to beg anyone else to validate what I knew in my bones, that love is measured in hours sat in waiting rooms and late-night drives across town, not in staged walks down an aisle performed for cameras. And so when my phone buzzed again with another string of messages from my mother demanding apologies, negotiations, and explanations, I silenced it and slid it into a drawer, not out of cruelty but out of certainty. Because I had already chosen where my loyalty lay and what my future would look like, and I understood at last that sometimes you do not burn a bridge, you simply move your house to the side of the river that has always carried you, and you let the other side scream into the wind. Without you. That was my last move, my cleanest revenge, and my quiet triumph. I had turned the tables, I had told the truth, and I had built something lasting out of a night designed to erase me.